All right, guys. So this is the first time that I'm actually going live using the remote view. I think it's actually going to publish directly to the American Overwatch YouTube channel. I hope. This is the first video that I've been making that I'm going to make since I've been away. Many of you have already known that my uncle has cancer. I was taking care of him. Took a sabbatical for like 90 days, so I'm back. Uh, Today we're going to cover some live hearings in the Senate floor. Nothing really of too alarming. I thought they were going to talk a little bit about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the justice and things like that, and have some debates on the floor regarding that. But right now they're just talking about some other things. So I'm going to have this playing for a little while. At 1 o'clock, there's going to be a White House press conference. So we'll switch gears from the Senate hearings over to that when that happens. So please enjoy. Let me know if you got any questions, comments, concerns. Go ahead and leave those down below and enjoy.
Amy was open about her questions and concerns, but once she was out there on her own, she always had complete confidence she would do and say the right thing. A third team member says this: "No surprise that she is leaving behind big shoes. She makes covering some of the largest counties and most difficult issues in the states look easy. Her knowledge of the issues give her the straight answers and who has the juicy county political social gossip. She also has been a great mentor to those in the field. I'm pretty sure she has walked every one of us through our first town halls, roundtables, site visits. She was someone you could rely on to give you feedback and let you know if you were on the right path." And the final comment from a team member: "I would just say that every time I ever come into contact with a community leader or elected official that has worked with Amy, no matter the political party, they absolutely love her. She has done so much for the Southern Oregon communities, just a beautiful human who has worked incredibly hard over the last decade plus to help rural Oregonians. She's funny, she's kind, she's blunt, she tells you like it is. I cannot reiterate enough how imperative her mentorship has been. She's a wealth of knowledge and experience that can't be replaced." I certainly could not have said it better. And so appreciate the team members who contributed those thoughts. On behalf of myself and the entire team, thank you, Amy Amrine, for all you have done for our team, for all you have done for the state, for all you've done for so many constituents working on so many complex and difficult issues. You are going to be deeply missed by the entire team, but by me most of all. It is the wish of the entire team that you will have a joyous, healthy retirement. Thank you, Madam President.
The question is on the nomination.
Madam President, I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sath, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Cantwell, Cardin, Cornyn, Crapo, Duckworth, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Grassley, Heinrich, Jones, Manchin, Markey, McConnell, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Paul, Purdue, Peters, Reed, Romney, Rounds, Schatz, Smith, Sullivan, Udall, Whitehouse, Wicker, Young. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Miss Cinema, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mrs. Leffler, Mrs. Leffler, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Seeing none, the yeas are 93, the nays are 2, and the nomination is confirmed.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it, the ayes do have it, and the motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to calendar 552, H.R. 8337.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 552, H.R. 8337, an act making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2021 and for other purposes.
Madam President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, I have 7 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of both the majority and the minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, with the COVID-19 pandemic continuing to devastate our public health and our economy, it is far past time that we reach agreement on another relief package that is so desperately needed. It will require good faith negotiations on both sides of the aisle, not just saying no and turning the tragedy of 200,000 COVID deaths into a partisan political issue. For my part, Madam President, I believe there should be 10 elements in the bill. First, there should be an extension of the Paycheck Protection Program, known as PPP. This is a program that I crafted with Senators Marco Rubio, Jeanne Shaheen, and Ben Cardin to provide forgivable loans to our small businesses so that they could pay their employees. I'm pleased to report, Madam President, that in my state, 28,000 small businesses, that's nearly 3 out of 4 of our small businesses, have taken advantage of $2.3 billion in forgivable loans, sustaining 250,000 jobs. It has truly made a difference. Now we need to do a second round of PPP for the hardest hit businesses, those for whom the first PPP loan was a lifeline, but they need additional help. So we've set a revenue test that if your revenue is 35% below what it was in an equivalent quarter last year, you would qualify for another PPP loan. In addition, those who have never received a first PPP loan could apply under the initial rules. This would make a difference in keeping our small businesses afloat, particularly those in the tourism industry that have been so hard hit, and their employees will still have jobs. Second, we need to provide aid to our schools. I've talked to superintendents all over the state of Maine, and I've visited schools in Hollis and Holton. I've seen firsthand the enormous investments they have had to make in order to reopen the schools safely or adapt to a hybrid model, depending on where the location is and the incidence of COVID-19. In one school that I visited, they have replaced all of the round tables around which the elementary school children would usually be working with desks lined up. It reminds me of when I went to elementary school because that was the style of teaching back then. They are sanitizing and deep cleaning the schools. They're trying to figure out what to do with the little toys that are used to teach children how to count. How do they sanitize them? Or do they get each child his or her own set of toys to place in individual bins? They're cutting new doors into the nurse's office so that no longer will ill children or staffers have to go through the front office. They're putting up plexiglass shields. They're adding additional bus routes in order to safely separate the children. These changes cost money, a lot of money. And it is one reason why, in addition to providing direct aid to our schools, we need to provide assistance to our states, our counties, and our communities. I have talked to city and town managers all over the state of Maine. They did not receive much from the initial allocation of funding that went to state governments, and they need help now. Let me give you an example. The city of Auburn has had to freeze 6 vacant positions because of expected revenue losses. That's 2 firefighters, a police officer, and 3 public works employees. These cuts come as the city of Auburn has spent $200,000 in new expenses responding to the virus. And, Mr. President, I've yet to talk to a city or town manager who is not experiencing the need to do similar cuts and have delayed or canceled public work projects like paving local roads. And that has a trickle-down effect. It affects the contractor and his or her employees who will no longer have that work. It affects their suppliers from whom the concrete or the tar is no longer going to be purchased. So this is why I feel strongly that the Bipartisan SMART Act, which I worked on with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, led by Senator Cassidy and Senator Menendez, needs to be passed. We can negotiate exactly how much money, exactly to whom it should go, but it's essential that aid go to the community level. Fourth, we need to help our airlines. Otherwise, come October 1st, just right around the corner, we're going to see massive layoffs. We're talking about between 80,000 and 100,000 layoffs of airline employees and also related jobs in airports, such as concessionaires. It will also lead to canceled service. If there are no longer crews for airplanes and ground crews, we're going to lose airline service to communities all over this country. We need not to forget the motor coach industry, which few people are talking about. They've been hurt by the cancellation of everything from school sports to tours. We need to help them survive this period of economic struggle. And Senator Jack Reed and I have introduced a bill with more than 40 co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle that would provide that assistance. Number 7, we need to continue investing in testing. That is key to reopening our economy and safely housing people in nursing homes and other long-term care facilities. I'm excited by the new Abbott Labs test, which will cost only $5 and give a result in 15 minutes. And I take particular pride because Abbott Labs has a large facility in my state, and they are expanding from Scarborough to Westbrook in order to produce these tests more rapidly. Number 8, we need to provide limited but important liability protections to our frontline hospital workers, to our small businesses, to our schools and colleges. One restaurant owner put it this way to me. He said, "Susan, what if I get sued despite taking every precaution, following the CDC guidelines, but a customer comes in, later develops the coronavirus, and sues me, saying, I think I got it in that restaurant." Well, I'm pretty sure that he didn't, but I still have to pay to defend that lawsuit. Now, clearly, we should not protect anyone who is guilty of gross negligence, but that's not what we're talking about here. Number 9, we need to provide a reasonable federal unemployment insurance supplement to help struggling families during this difficult time when so many people have lost jobs through no fault of their own. But we need to make sure that we're not creating a disincentive to return to work when jobs reopen. That's why I like the approach of either having an 80% replacement of the pre-job loss wage, or figuring out a formula that would approach 80%. That's far higher than the normal wage replacement under our state systems, but these are extraordinary times. I may have lost count, but number 9, we need an emergency appropriation for the U.S. Postal Service. Otherwise, I am worried that the Postal Service will not be able to meet its payroll starting the second quarter of next year. Think of the costs that the Postal Service has incurred. It has had to retrofit every post office, every processing center in this country, as well as to provide protective gear to its postal employees, who are both essential and frontline workers. Mr. President, those are the elements that I believe should be in the next coronavirus package. And while there are disagreements on perhaps 3 of the 10 elements that I've suggested, by and large, there is agreement on 7 of the elements. There may be disputes about exactly how much money should be appropriated, but we can work those disputes out, just as we do in the appropriations process. And we simply cannot wait and do nothing and just hope for the best. Hope is not an effective strategy when it comes to dealing with this persistent pandemic. Mr. President, the American people have demonstrated resilience, courage, and compassion during this crisis, but they need our additional help. I hope that next week we will put aside the partisan bickering, the just say no approach that we have seen, unfortunately, from the Democratic leader, and we will come together for the good of the American people, that we will come together not as Democrats and Republicans and independents, but as Americans to do what our country needs done right now. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggests the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Okay, guys. So it looks like they're in a quorum call. So what we're going to do is we're going to pause here on the Senate hearings and get ready for the 1300 press conference with Kayla McKinney at the White House. That's going to happen again at 1300. So we're going to go ahead and pause here. Hopefully we'll see you guys over there.